How China can surprise Trump. Few doubt that Trump will begin to exert economic pressure on China in his second term, as indicated by the nature of the selection of people for key posts and the experience of the previous 4 years. However, China, despite its peaceful rhetoric, clearly does not adhere to the philosophy of turn the other cheek, and most likely will be able to deliver very sensitive retaliatory strikes for the White House. Beijing has a political advantage. The Chinese system is very far from the liberal democracy of the Western type, and this makes it much more stable in the coming economic war. At the same time, the American and Chinese economies are largely interdependent, and Beijing, unlike, for example, Europe, does not have the habit of harming itself purely for the sake of making life worse for its opponents. So any retaliatory steps will be strictly dosed. What steps can the Chinese leadership take to make their retaliatory strikes as painful as possible for Washington and at the same time expedient? The first and most obvious thing Beijing can do is to start dumping U.S. treasuries by selling them on the global market. These bonds are the instrument with which the U.S. borrows money, and selling off the paper will lead to a decrease in their value. They will be quoted well below par, and investors will be happy to take them apart. If Washington urgently needs to borrow money, it will find that it has become much more difficult to do so. The market is already overflowing with cheap bonds, and no one will want to buy new ones at par. Beijing will partially close the debt valve, a very sensitive blow to the American economy and to the position of the new administration. At the moment, Beijing has accumulated treasuries worth $770 billion, and Hong Kong controls another $220 billion of U.S. government debt. In other words, the PRC has U.S. bonds worth almost $1 trillion, and they only need to dump a small part of this amount to cause paralysis of the American debt market. However, to begin with, China will only need to refuse to buy new tranches of treasury bonds. The disappearance of such a large consumer will be very sensitive for the U.S., and in order to find new clients, they will have to make serious concessions, raise the yield of securities, for example. Imagine that you take away a credit card from a person who is used to living in debt. This is approximately what the American economy will feel. Of course, the PRC will not use this tool for no reason. Dumping treasury bonds will lead to a strengthening of the yuan, which is bad for exports, and destabilize global financial markets. But the U.S. would do well to understand that Beijing can technically do this. The second step that China's leadership may take, fortunately it already has experience in a trade war with the United States, is targeted tariffs against American agricultural products. Last time, Beijing imposed tariffs on American soybeans, meat and milk. These measures hit small businesses in Iowa, Minnesota, Indiana, Nebraska, Texas, and Wisconsin. Considering that in 2025 the trade deficit in U.S. agriculture is expected to exceed $45 billion, any restrictions will be very painful for farmers who voted for Trump. At the same time, in 2018, China was not really ready for a trade war and acted reactively. But even in that situation, it was able to provoke a wave of bankruptcies among American farmers. Now Beijing has prepared much more seriously, creating strategic reserves of agricultural products and reorienting itself to Brazilian imports. In theory, China can also put economic pressure on corporations affiliated with the Republicans, primarily oil and gas companies. Despite the obvious coolness in relations, China continues to actively import American liquefied gas, with preliminary statistics for the first 10 months of 2024 showing a 60% increase. And although the Chinese economy certainly needs cheap fuel, Beijing has diversified imports quite skillfully and can impose very painful restrictions on American oil and gas corporations. And of course, Beijing still has further opportunities to put pressure on the U.S. economy and defense potential through the market for critical materials, often understood as rare earth metals, but the concept is broader. In early December, China limited the export of gallium and germanium, as well as superhard materials, and there is reason to believe that in the event of an escalation, Beijing may go further. Over the past 2 decades, China has spent money and political capital to gain control over critical materials production around the world. Through smart investments and so-called capital diplomacy, China controls 58% of the world's lithium production and is a major player in nickel, mined in Indonesia, and cobalt, Democratic Republic of Congo. In theory, this gives Beijing the ability to control the lithium-ion battery market, which is critical to the global economy. Having the ability doesn't mean China will take advantage of it. Beijing is a persistent but very cautious player, using its resources very sparingly.